Grizzly bear attacks strike with terrifying speed and primal force. One moment, it's calm. The next, chaos. A teenage girl walking with classmates, a dock worker finishing his shift, a stylist mid-trim. In each case, the bear appears as an unstoppable force of nature. Hunger, territory, surprise, whatever the trigger, the result is often blood, panic, and trauma that lingers for life. Join us as we explore 6 harrowing stories of bear attacks that remind us of the unpredictable nature of wildlife. In the thick, pine-scented wilderness of the Amur region in southeastern Russia, the spring of 2001 marked the beginning of a new school tradition, a multi-day nature excursion for top-performing students. This part of the Russian Far East, known for its rugged mountain terrain and deep forests, had long been celebrated for its pristine beauty. However, it was also home to one of the world's most elusive and formidable predators, the Ussuri brown bear, a massive grizzly subspecies native to the area. The forested region surrounding a well-known nature reserve, though rarely visited and difficult to access, had not seen any serious bear-related incidents for over a decade. Local authorities, encouraged by the warm seasonal conditions, believed that the rising temperatures had driven most large wildlife to higher elevations. Interpreting this as a safe window, school officials approved the hike. A group of 25 students, primarily juniors from a prestigious lyceum in a nearby city, embarked on a 3-day forest expedition under the guidance of 2 biology teachers and a local outdoorsman. Among the students was 16-year-old Katya Petrov, known for her intelligence, determination, and deep interest in the natural world. According to survivors, she had shown particular enthusiasm for the trip. Her father, an amateur botanist, had taught her the Latin names of local plants, and she had once expressed a strong desire to study ecology as a career. The hike began without incident. The group followed a worn trail alongside a glacial stream, eventually setting up camp in a quiet clearing by the second evening. Spirits were high. Students were relieved to be free from academic pressure, enjoying the sense of adventure as they collected firewood and helped prepare a modest meal consisting of dried fish and bread. The next morning, they broke camp and continued deeper into the dense cedar and spruce forest, following a narrow path along a tributary of a remote river system. By mid-afternoon, the group had stopped near a ravine to rest and refill water bottles. The forest around them had grown noticeably silent. One of the teachers, Oleg Vanyushin, would later recall feeling a strange sense of unease, though he dismissed it at the time as a symptom of fatigue. Moments later, the stillness was shattered by a deep, guttural sound emanating from a nearby thicket. Eyewitnesses described a massive bear, estimated at nearly 700 kilograms, emerging suddenly from the edge of the forest. Its fur was smeared with mud, and its posture was unmistakably aggressive. At first, some students believed it might be part of a prank, or that the animal was still at a safe distance. But when the bear released a thunderous roar and charged, the atmosphere turned instantly to panic. The teachers urgently instructed the students to run, prompting a chaotic scramble as they scattered along the trail and into the surrounding trees. Katya, according to classmates, had initially frozen. Whether from shock or disbelief was unclear. As she began to step backward, the bear closed the distance in seconds and struck her down with terrifying force. What followed was confusion and horror. The teachers attempted to rally the students while throwing rocks and shouting to distract the animal. However, their efforts were futile. The bear focused solely on Katya, attacking her with overwhelming violence. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute. No one could get close enough to intervene. A flare was fired into the sky, and only then did the bear retreat into the woods. In the aftermath, the group remained huddled together for nearly an hour, many of them crying and in shock. The guide eventually managed to reach emergency services using a satellite device he had stored in his backpack. A rescue helicopter arrived 3 hours later. By that time, any hope of saving Katya had long passed. Her remains were recovered, and the rest of the group was transported back to the city. In the days that followed, the city mourned deeply. Katya's parents, Dmitry and Galina Petrov, received condolences from government officials, but those who knew them said the loss left a permanent and immeasurable void. The school canceled all future field trips. Officials launched an immediate investigation and dispatched a hunting team to search for the bear, concerned it had become dangerously acclimated to human presence. The animal was never located. Mental health professionals were sent to support the traumatized students. Many suffered symptoms of acute psychological stress. One student reportedly developed a severe speech impediment. Others left the school altogether within the year. Katya's closest friend, Irina Kovalenko, who had been only a few meters away during the attack, eventually transferred to a private institution in the capital and never returned to the region. In response to public outcry, regional authorities implemented a new rule requiring armed wildlife escorts for all student expeditions in the area. Still, conservationists argued that such precautions would have limited impact without broader efforts to reduce human encroachment into known bear habitats. Years later, the remote stretch of forest near the river remained unmarked by any memorial. Locals referred to it only in hushed tones, using vague terms like "that place." Few chose to visit without necessity. Among the silent trees, once filled with youthful laughter and excitement, the memory of that day lingered heavily in the minds of those who had survived. Katya Petrov's name lived on, not in official reports, but in the unshakable memories of her classmates. Though officially recorded as a tragic wildlife encounter, the survivors remembered it in far more visceral terms. The moment had unfolded with shocking speed. There had been no time to think, only to run. What remained most vivid for them was the sound, the roar that cut through the silence, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that followed. No amount of time or distance had managed to erase it. The marine port on Kodiak Island, situated off Alaska's southern coast, had long served as a vital artery for the state's commercial fishing industry. Its harbors were stacked high with nets, crab pots, and crates of salmon, surfaces slick with fish oil, and the constant hum of forklifts and radio chatter. The air was thick with the scent of salt, diesel, and blood. Sea lions occasionally hauled out near the docks, and bald eagles soared overhead, waiting for scraps. But in the summer of 1993, that tenuous balance between industrial rhythm and wilderness presence shattered for a few harrowing minutes, when one of the world's largest bear species walked straight into the heart of the operation. That evening, a dense bank of fog drifted in from offshore, dampening visibility and muting the usual clatter. The night shift was in full swing. Dozens of workers remained on the docks, unloading massive hauls of pink and chum salmon from vessels recently returned from distant fishing grounds. Among them was 34-year-old Viktor Semyonov, a soft-spoken worker known for enduring the grueling shifts most avoided. He had come to Alaska from eastern Russia, drawn by the cold, the quiet, and the promise of steady work. As the crew wrapped up the offloading of a long-haul fishing boat renowned for heavy catches, workers began disposing of fish waste into an open container near the edge of the dock. The scent, pungent and unmistakable, wafted inland. What they didn't know was that a hungry bear, drawn down from the forested hills beyond the industrial zone, had caught wind of the remains and followed the gravel access road to the edge of the facility. It wasn't noticed until it was practically among them. A worker returning from a break caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the fog. Panic followed. Crates hit the ground. Men bolted in every direction, some leaping onto boats, others ducking behind forklifts or diving into the cover of net stacks. It was instant chaos. Victor had been standing near the central loading area, clipboard in hand, reviewing offload tallies. When he looked up, the massive bear was striding directly toward the scent trail, ignoring shouts and machinery. Its size was staggering, but even more unsettling was its speed. It passed forklifts and humans without pause, focused entirely on the scent of blood and waste. In an attempt to divert its attention, Victor raised his arms and tried to redirect its path. That movement sealed his fate. The bear swerved toward him, charging with shocking momentum. In a flash, it closed the distance and struck him with one massive paw. The blow hurled Victor backward into a stack of plastic fish bins. His left shoulder shattered on impact. Before he could scramble to safety, the bear lunged again, claws slashing through his thigh as it tried to pull him free of the plastic crates. Disoriented but conscious, Victor reached for a nearby metal rod and struck blindly. That brief defiance, an act of pure survival, slowed the bear for seconds, long enough for others to act. From a control shack at the end of the dock, several workers sprinted forward carrying flares and handheld spotlights. They flooded the fog with beams of intense light and slammed metal objects together in a deafening barrage. Startled by the sudden noise and glare, the bear hesitated. Pacing briefly, it let out a low growl, then turned and disappeared back into the fog that had cloaked its arrival. By the time emergency responders reached the dock, Victor was barely conscious. He had suffered a shattered scapula, multiple broken ribs, deep gashes along his upper leg, and extensive soft tissue damage. Stabilized at a small local clinic, he was soon airlifted to a hospital in the state's largest city. There, surgeons worked through the night to save his arm and leg. According to doctors, it was a miracle that no major arteries had been torn. His recovery took over a year, and he never returned to industrial work. The attack sent shockwaves through the tightly knit port community. In the following days, safety measures were scrutinized. Disposal protocols for fish waste were rewritten. Wildlife alarms were installed along the perimeter fence. Motion sensors were set to trigger floodlights and warning sirens if large animals approached. Veteran dock workers admitted they had never imagined a bear would cross so deeply into human space. They had assumed the clatter of machines and the press of people would drive wild animals away. Instead, they were forced to reckon with the opposite, that human activity, especially when it involved food waste, could attract wildlife into dangerously close proximity. Victor gave a full account to investigators, followed by interviews with local journalists, and later, a small independent crew working on a documentary about human-wildlife conflict in the northern wilderness. He described the bear's eyes not as hateful or enraged, but focused and remote, intent on food, not violence. He hadn't been targeted. He had simply stood between hunger and its source. By the next season, infrastructure at the port had changed. Extra lighting was installed along all access paths. Temporary fencing was erected in sections known to border wilderness trails. A wildlife monitor was brought in to patrol during nighttime offloading operations. And although rumors occasionally swirled of bear sightings further inland, there were no further incidents reported at the dock for the rest of the decade. Victor quietly retreated from public life. He purchased a modest property near a remote bay on Kodiak Island, where he raised livestock and spent his days painting coastal scenes. He never sought compensation, attention, or sympathy. When asked about the attack years later, he offered only a brief explanation, that he had simply found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. The rhythms of the port eventually resumed. Cranes whined, radios crackled, metal clanged. But for those who had witnessed that fog-shrouded night, the memory endured, a quiet, massive figure emerging from the darkness. It was a reminder that even in places dominated by human hands and machines, the wild was never far off, and sometimes it walked straight through the gates. In the foothills near Flat Creek, a small town east of the Rockies in Colorado, the autumn of 2014 had arrived early. Temperatures dropped rapidly, and wildlife sightings around the town's residential outskirts became more frequent. While residents were accustomed to the occasional visit from a black bear rummaging through unsecured garbage bins, the number of incidents that year, and the animal's boldness, began to unsettle the community. By mid-October, local authorities started receiving reports of a bear approaching a campground just past a regional highway. Campers said it had torn through their food supplies and overturned fire pits. A maintenance worker noted seeing it circling the latrines around dusk. The bear showed no signs of fear, and that shift in behavior became the first serious warning. Officer Elias Crowfoot, 42, a senior deputy with the Flat Creek Sheriff's Department, was one of the most experienced members of the force. A former forest ranger, Elias was known for his steady judgment and instinctive understanding of wilderness behavior. One Saturday morning, he was dispatched along with 3 deputies to investigate the campground after a family reported claw marks on their car and a shredded backpack left outside their tent overnight. The campground operated on a limited basis during the off-season, frequented mostly by hunters and weekend hikers. When the deputies arrived, the scene was quiet, but evidence of the bear's visit was everywhere. Tipped-over trash bins, muddy paw prints, and torn plastic coolers littered the area. The team divided into pairs to sweep the campground. They carried wildlife deterrents, air horns and noisemakers supplied by animal control. Deputy Rena Halverson later described what happened in her official report. Elias had been walking near the tree line along a shallow creek bed when he spotted the bear, about 80 feet ahead. It was an adult black bear, smaller than a grizzly, but large enough to inflict serious harm, particularly if it had been conditioned to associate humans with food. Elias signaled for the others to hold back while he advanced. He believed a firm, direct presence could drive the bear off without confrontation. Drawing on years of field experience, he slowly stepped into a clearing, holding a collapsible baton and making deliberate noise to assert his presence. But the bear didn't run. Instead, it lowered its head and charged. The entire encounter unfolded in under 10 seconds. Elias had no time to retreat. He raised the baton and shouted, but the bear struck him with its full weight, knocking him flat. The other deputies, positioned nearby, began making noise and deploying air horns. But the bear, now in a frenzy, bit down across Elias's chest and tore at his side with its claws. 2 deputies sprinted toward the scene with flares in hand, while the third radioed for backup. One flare landed near the bear's hindquarters, burning its fur. Startled and injured, it turned and crashed into the forest, disappearing into the dense underbrush. When the deputies reached Elias, he was unconscious. His injuries were catastrophic: puncture wounds across his torso and abdomen, severe lacerations, and a compromised airway. Emergency CPR was attempted immediately, but the outcome was clear within minutes. Paramedics arrived 16 minutes later and pronounced Elias dead at the scene. The incident shocked the Flat Creek law enforcement community. While deputies were trained for a range of emergencies, vehicle accidents, domestic calls, wilderness rescues, losing one of their own in a wild animal attack, especially in front of their eyes, was something none of them had expected. Wildlife officials launched a full-scale investigation. Using bait traps and motion-activated cameras, Colorado authorities attempted to locate the bear. Based on the condition of the site and prior complaints, it became clear the animal had been feeding off waste dumped illegally near the campground for an extended period. Repeated access to food with no consequences had made it bold, even aggressive. Within days, the bear was located, tranquilized, and euthanized. News of Elias Crowfoot's death spread quickly through the state. Tributes came from sheriff's departments, conservation officers, and wildlife professionals alike. Though fatalities involving black bears were rare, the attack reminded everyone of a hard truth. Wild animals could become dangerously unpredictable, especially when habituated to human food. Elias left behind his wife, Janelle, and a teenage son, River. At the memorial service held in the town's municipal park, fellow officers shared stories of his quiet leadership and lifelong respect for the outdoors. Many recalled how he used to take his son hiking through the same forests, where he later lost his life. In a local news interview, Deputy Halverson reflected on how the incident had altered her perspective. She had always believed that proper training and vigilance could manage encounters with wildlife. But that morning revealed something harsher. Wild animals don't always follow expected patterns, and even the most seasoned professionals could find themselves caught off guard. In the months following the attack, state authorities introduced stricter regulations on garbage disposal near wilderness-adjacent campgrounds. Fines increased for unsecured waste, and new bear-resistant containers were installed throughout the Flat Creek region. Signage warning of bear activity was expanded, and a wildlife response training program was created in Elias's honor, ensuring that other rural officers would have access to the kind of preparation he had once championed. For those who had served beside him, Elias became more than just a fallen officer. He came to symbolize the intersection of duty and unpredictability, of the human role in an untamed landscape that still resisted control. His legacy was not only a tragedy, but a clear and lasting reminder. Nature may retreat under pressure, but it never fully yields. And sometimes it pushes back in the most unforgiving ways. Clemtu, a small coastal village nestled along British Columbia's Inside Passage, had always lived in rhythm with the sea. Surrounded by dense rainforest and glacier-carved fjords, the area was a haven for salmon, and for the grizzly bears that followed them. Locals respected the balance, knowing the bears fed along the rivers just as their ancestors had. But in 2007, one man's fishing trip tipped that balance into something far more violent. Mark Leland wasn't a local. A 39-year-old software technician from Vancouver, he had driven north in late August to rent a remote cabin near the edge of the Kitasoo Conservancy. The area, known for its unlogged valleys and protected wildlife corridors, had recently begun drawing a steady stream of visitors, anglers in particular, eager to try their luck in salmon-rich streams. Mark came alone, his vehicle loaded with rods, reels, and a cooler full of gear. It was meant to be a break from city life. The cabin sat near the mouth of a stream feeding into Finlayson Channel. Locals had quietly cautioned him about bear activity near the water, especially in late summer when salmon were at their peak. He acknowledged the warnings, but perhaps too casually. He had done backcountry trips before, after all. He assumed that staying alert and making noise would be enough. On the third day of his stay, around dusk, Mark stood knee-deep in the cold stream, casting for pink salmon. Hours earlier, he had noticed movement across the waterline, likely a bird or an otter, he assumed. The rushing current masked most surrounding noise, and with his focus narrowed to the rod in his hand, he failed to notice the grizzly that had emerged from the trees behind him. What he did notice, too late, was the crack of dry branches and the sudden splash of heavy paws. The bear wasn't charging at full speed, but its approach was deliberate and low, its eyes fixed not on Mark, but on the string of fresh salmon he had pulled from the stream moments earlier. Acting on reflex, Mark reached for his fishing spear, a 3-foot metal-tipped pole he'd packed more as a novelty than a necessity, and raised it defensively. As the bear lunged for the fish, Mark jabbed blindly. The spear struck just above the animal's shoulder. It wasn't a serious wound, but it startled the bear, which roared and retreated into the tree line, limping heavily. Soaked and trembling, Mark backed away from the water and gathered his gear, constantly checking the woods behind him. He convinced himself the encounter was over. The bear had been wounded. It would likely avoid further contact. He was wrong. The next morning, still shaken, he debated ending the trip early, but the weather was perfect. The cooler was full, and the idea of abandoning his plans felt premature. Around noon, he returned to the same stream, this time with a can of bear spray clipped to his hip and the spear resting within easy reach. According to emergency responders who later interviewed him, Mark had been fishing for less than 20 minutes when he heard a sharp rustle to his left. Looking up, he spotted the same bear, easily recognizable by its size and the visible wound on its shoulder, watching him from beyond a thicket of devil's club. This time it didn't hesitate. It charged directly, driven by a volatile mix of pain, fear, and territorial instinct. Mark raised the spear again, but the bear struck first. It slammed into him with brutal force, knocking him backward into the shallows. Before he could react, it was on top of him, swiping at his chest and tearing into his thigh. The bear spray had been knocked loose. One of his legs was pinned beneath the animal's weight. He shouted and kicked wildly, reaching for anything within arm's reach. His hand closed around a rock. In a desperate move, he flung it at the bear's face, striking its snout. The animal recoiled slightly, just enough for Mark to drag himself forward and grab the spear. He swung hard, hitting the bear's side. The blow wasn't deep enough to cause real damage, but it gave him a momentary advantage. He scrambled backward, bleeding heavily from his thigh and ribs. The bear didn't follow. It stood for a few seconds, heaving, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Mark made it back to the cabin, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He used his belt as a makeshift tourniquet and activated the satellite radio he had barely tested prior to the trip. Through a crackling connection, he reached emergency services, who coordinated a helicopter evac through a regional search and rescue unit based in a nearby coastal community. By the time help arrived, Mark had collapsed on the cabin floor. He was unconscious from blood loss. Medics later confirmed that if the artery in his leg had been any more damaged, he likely wouldn't have survived. Mark spent a month recovering in a hospital back in Vancouver. His injuries included deep muscle tears in the thigh, a broken rib, and puncture wounds across his torso. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The incident sparked a wave of discussion across the region. Conservation officers issued warnings about the increasing risk of bear habituation, particularly in areas where people were leaving behind food waste or fish remains. Though Mark had followed proper procedure, not everyone had, and this bear had likely been conditioned long before his arrival. Wildlife officers eventually tracked the bear using motion-activated trail cameras. After confirming its identity and behavior, they made the difficult decision to euthanize it. The move divided opinion. Some residents cited public safety, while others criticized human encroachment and poor practices that led to the conflict. Mark never returned to Klemtu. In a brief statement shared with local newspapers, he said he bore no resentment toward the bear or the people who had warned him. He blamed something more abstract, the distance between hearing a warning and truly respecting it. He had learned that the wilderness doesn't care how prepared you feel or how skilled you think you are. When the balance tips, it often happens without warning and without mercy. The island town of Severo-Kurilsk, perched on the northern edge of Paramushir in Russia's Kuril Islands, had long endured the restless churn of the Pacific. Snow-capped volcanoes loomed in the distance, and bitter winds swept in from the Sea of Okhotsk. It was the kind of place where survival was woven into the fabric of daily life. Harsh winters, frequent earthquakes, and the isolation of remote geography shaped every decision the locals made. In 1998, following a particularly punishing winter, the island's wildlife patterns began to shift. Snow had clung to the ground well into May, delaying the growth of berries and limiting the movement of salmon through the rivers. Grizzly bears, already under stress from dwindling food sources, started to stray into human settlements with increasing boldness. The people of Severo-Kurilsk, who were accustomed to seeing bears only on distant ridgelines or along remote shores, began spotting them much closer, scavenging near trash bins, prowling alleyways, and walking confidently through empty lots during the night. Then, on a gray, windy afternoon in late October, one bear went much farther than simply wandering. The modest hair salon on Zelenaya Street served as one of the few places in town that combined practicality with a sense of community. Though compact, it was well kept. A two-room space featuring large front windows, pale blue walls, and aging blow dryers that hummed with turbine-like insistence. On that particular day, the salon was busy. 6 customers sat at various stages of haircuts and touch-ups, while stylists moved with practiced rhythm between chairs. Among them was Elena Borzakova, a 31-year-old hairdresser known throughout town for her quiet demeanor and remarkable skill with shears. She had worked in that same salon for nearly 10 years and lived just 2 streets away with her younger sister. Unknown to anyone at the time, a large grizzly bear had been foraging near the edge of town earlier that day. Agitated by hunger and drawn by the scent of human food, it had wandered beyond the forest boundary before noon. It moved quietly behind the local bakery, lingered near the post office, and then made its way toward the town center. The odors emanating from the salon, chemical fragrances from hair dye, the sterile tang of shampoo, and the remnants of staff lunches might not have seemed edible to a human, but to a starving bear, they suggested nourishment. At precisely 3:17 p.m., just as Elena was trimming a teenager's hair near the back of the salon, a thunderous crash shattered the afternoon calm. The bear had hurled its weight against the front window, once, then again. On the third impact, the glass gave way entirely, exploding inward and scattering shards across the waiting area. What followed was instant chaos. Clients bolted from their seats. One stylist stumbled and fell trying to escape. Curling irons clattered to the floor, unplugged in panic. The bear stepped through the broken frame, its massive body crunching down on glass, fur matted, eyes wide and frenzied. Witness accounts later recalled the bear rising on its hind legs once before lunging fully into the space. People scrambled in all directions. Some fled through a back exit. Others sought cover behind styling chairs or overturned furniture. Elena, unfortunately, had been closest to the front. As she tried to move out of harm's way, the bear intercepted her. It pinned her against the wall in a matter of seconds. The attack happened with overwhelming speed, too fast for anyone to intervene. The bear's claws tore through her shoulder and chest. A customer who had hidden nearby later recounted hearing a single scream before the bear roared again, shaking the walls. Blood streaked across the mirrors. The tile floor became dangerously slick. 2 men from a nearby market, having heard the commotion, rushed over. One of them carried a flare gun, kept for emergencies. He fired it through the shattered window, striking the wall just behind the bear. The sudden flare of heat and light disoriented the animal. Snarling, it backed off, knocking over chairs and sending more glass skittering across the floor before retreating into the street. Emergency services arrived approximately 10 minutes later. Elena was still breathing, but her condition was dire. She had suffered massive trauma, including critical blood loss and deep lacerations across her torso and upper body. Paramedics stabilized her as best they could and rushed her to the regional clinic. Due to the island's limited medical facilities, she was airlifted the following morning to a hospital in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. She never regained consciousness. 2 days after the attack, Elena passed away from her injuries. The town fell into mourning. Elena had not just been a hairdresser, she had been a friend, a familiar face in the neighborhood, someone who once cut hair by candlelight during power outages. Her funeral was held in the community hall, with mourners spilling out into the freezing street, bundled in coats, their breaths fogging in the bitter wind. In response to the tragedy, regional wildlife officials arrived from the mainland to assess the danger. They discovered tracks confirming that at least 3 other bears had been circling the outskirts of town. Traps were deployed, and patrols began monitoring the area around Severo-Kurilsk day and night. Residents were urged not to walk alone, particularly near wooded areas. Schools adjusted their schedules to ensure students returned home before sunset. The bear responsible for the Salon attack was located 5 days later using a combination of bait and thermal imaging from a helicopter. Authorities found it near a stream roughly 2 kilometers from town. Due to its aggressive behavior and continued proximity to human dwellings, it was euthanized on site. The incident brought about lasting changes in how the village approached human-wildlife interactions. Trash collection became centralized and heavily reinforced. Disposal of food waste was subject to stricter controls. A steel-reinforced door replaced the broken salon entrance, and other businesses followed suit, installing their own defensive upgrades. Despite these measures, emotional scars remained. The salon remained closed for several months. The local hairdressing community was gripped by lingering fear and guilt. Some stylists chose never to return to work. Others, like Elena's colleague Tamara, resumed their duties, but carried pepper spray on their belts. A strange and sobering addition to the daily tools of their trade. Elena's sister, Marina, relocated to a mainland city the following year. She declined all requests for interviews and never spoke publicly about the incident. Long after the broken glass was swept away and the blood scrubbed clean, the memory of that day endured. It served as a grim reminder. When hunger drives wildlife into human spaces, there are often no barriers strong enough to keep danger at bay. In the northern reaches of a well-known park, where geothermal vents blur the skyline and dense forest presses tightly against meadows, human curiosity often brushes too close to the edge of wilderness. It was in this delicate zone that Alex Greaves, a 41-year-old wildlife photographer from Oregon, found himself one October morning in 2019. Alex had been visiting the region for over a decade, compiling footage of bison herds, wolf packs, and migratory birds for documentaries and nature magazines. But in recent years, his focus had shifted to drone photography, a new and striking way to capture animal movement from above. Though regulations clearly banned flying drones within park boundaries, enforcement had proven difficult, and for Alex, the chance to get aerial shots of grizzlies with their cubs was too tempting to ignore. That morning, he had parked at a pull-off along a mountain pass and hiked a short distance into the backcountry, the drone packed carefully in his weatherproof bag. According to his later account, he had spotted signs of bear activity, scattered logs, claw marks, and matted grass, but judged the area safe enough. He set up his gear and launched the drone into the misty sky, scanning a hillside where grizzlies were known to forage before hibernation. He soon spotted what he had hoped for, a mother bear with 2 cubs, moving slowly along the slope. From above, the drone captured stunning visuals. Thick brown fur contrasted against yellowing foliage. Alex, hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, adjusted the angles. But within minutes, the mother bear grew agitated. The buzzing overhead was subtle, but for animals with acute hearing and protective instincts, it was perceived as a threat. The bear rose on her hind legs, sniffed the air, and became visibly distressed. A sudden gust of wind pushed the drone sideways. Its rotors clipped a tree branch, sending it spiraling into the brush just 30 feet from the bear. Realizing the crash location was dangerously close, Alex hesitated. But the drone had cost nearly $3,000, and the memory card inside held hours of rare footage. Against better judgment, he crept forward to retrieve it, keeping low and scanning the woods for any sign of movement. What he didn't realize was that the mother bear had already spotted him. As he stepped into a small clearing, the brush rustled violently. The bear charged out, claws tearing through undergrowth, head lowered and teeth bared. He had seconds to react. He raised his arms and tried to backpedal, but the bear reached him in a heartbeat. It slammed into him with enough force to send him flying backward into a tree trunk. The impact broke several ribs and left him stunned. Before he could rise, the bear pounded the ground near his head and let out a guttural growl. It swiped once, catching his side, then circled as if to strike again. But the cubs, still some distance away, began crying out, and the mother turned, choosing to retreat rather than continue the assault. Alex, disoriented and gasping for breath, managed to pull out his emergency radio and call for help. The signal was faint, but it reached a ranger outpost several miles away. A search and rescue team reached him by helicopter 90 minutes later. He was airlifted to a hospital in Montana, where he underwent surgery for a punctured lung, fractured ribs, and a torn abdominal muscle. He spent 10 days in recovery and months in physical therapy. The story drew national attention, not just because of the dramatic escape, but because it exposed a growing concern. Drones and wildlife do not mix. Park officials confirmed that drone activity had been increasing despite the ban, often disturbing sensitive animals in critical habitats. Alex, though criticized by some for his recklessness, cooperated fully with authorities. He admitted fault and later participated in a public awareness campaign on drone use in protected areas. What many didn't realize was how close the situation had come to being fatal. Rangers at the scene later noted that if the bear had aimed a few inches higher on the swipe to Alex's chest, it could have torn into his neck. Even more troubling was the detail that the mother bear remained in the area for several hours after the attack, agitated and pacing. For safety, the area had to be closed off for 3 days. Multiple park staff were stationed on rotating shifts to ensure no hikers wandered too close. Officials feared that the bear, now accustomed to unfamiliar flying objects in human proximity, might begin associating people with intrusion, and that was a formula for future aggression. Park biologists later held a press briefing, emphasizing that mother bears with cubs are already on edge late in the season. As food grows scarce before hibernation, any added stress, especially from unfamiliar sights or sounds like drones, can result in explosive, defensive behavior. They cited Alex's case as a textbook example of how new technology, when misused, can disrupt delicate natural balances and endanger both wildlife and people. They also stressed that retrieval attempts, even of expensive equipment, should never come before personal safety. Alex never flew a drone again. He returned to photography, but only with ground-based lenses and a renewed sense of caution. He sold most of his drone gear and donated the proceeds to a local conservation fund. In interviews, he explained that his intent had never been to provoke the animal, only to observe. But the consequences were real. He lost nearly all his equipment, faced fines, and endured lasting physical pain. 2 years later, in a short essay for a nature journal, he reflected that the encounter had reshaped not only his spine, but his understanding of his place in the world. In trying to get closer to nature, he had crossed a line, and nature had responded with force. For the park, the incident prompted swift changes. Rangers received upgraded drone detection technology and training. Warning signage was expanded across major trailheads, and enforcement teams began issuing steeper fines for unauthorized drone use. But perhaps the most lasting impact was the shift in how visitors saw their role in the wild. Alex's near-fatal encounter became part of ranger orientation videos and school outreach programs. His mistakes served as a cautionary tale, real, raw, and avoidable. The drone footage, retrieved from the crash site by rangers days later, was never released publicly. But according to those who reviewed it, the final recorded frame showed a massive shadow rising just beyond the trees, followed by sudden static. For many, that still image, an unintended glimpse into a moment of danger, was reminder enough. The wild has boundaries, and ignoring them comes at a cost.